मत्संगीन मद्गुरो मन्महांतुना मन्निस्तारक मद्भाग्य मदानंद नमस्ते असाधु साधुतादायन अतिनीचोच्चताकर आनमंच गदाचिन्मां प्रेमनाथ ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय. Okay, 1.18.41 to 1.19.4. निशम्य शप्तम मतदर्पम नरेन्द्रम स ब्राह्मणो नात्मजम अभ्यनंदत अहो बताम हो महदद्यते कृतम अल्पीयसि द्रोह उरुर्दमो धृतः. The father heard from his son that the king had been cursed, although he should never have been condemned, for he was the best amongst all human beings. The rishi did not congratulate his son, but on the contrary, began to repent, saying, Alas, what a greatly sinful act was performed by my son. He has awarded heavy punishment for an insignificant offense. An abhinandana vakya maho ityadi. So it was noted in the previous verse that he asked, what is this insult that you have committed? Why have you done it? In other words, he did not appreciate what Shringi had done. So that is now being reported here. What exactly he said. You have committed a great sin. Mahat papam kritam. Te tvaya mahat papam kritam. You have given too much of a punishment. There is something called atidanda, excessive punishment, over punishment. There is under punishment, there is over punishment. Both are errors. Atadarham. He did not deserve this. There is atadarham. Atadarham. Never to be condemned. He didn't deserve to be cursed. Hare Agya, oh you foolish, why? Vaya mahadam papam kritam. You have committed a great sin. Yad alpi yasi, ati alpe drohe aparadhe, urur mahan dandaha dritaha arpitaha. For a small error, you have awarded a great punishment. The king is the best of all human beings. He is the representative of God, and he is never to be condemned for any of his actions. In other words, a king can do no wrong. The king may order hanging of a culprit son of a Brahmana, but he does not become sinful for killing a Brahmana. Even if there is nothing wrong with the king, he is never to be condemned. A medical practitioner may kill a patient by mistaken treatment, but such a killer is never condemned to death. So what to speak of a good and pious king like Maharaj Parikshit? In the Vedic way of life, the king is trained to become a Rajarshi or a great saint, although he is ruling as a king. It is a king only by his good government, by whose good government the citizens can live peacefully and without any fear. The Rajarshi would manage his kingdom so nicely and piously that his subjects would respect him as if he were the Lord himself. That is the instruction of the Vedas. The king is called Narendra, or the best amongst the human beings. How then could a king like Maharaj Parikshit be condemned by an inexperienced, puffed up son of a Brahmana, even though he had attained the powers of a qualified Brahmana? Since Shamika Rishi was an experienced, good Brahmana, he did not approve of the actions of his condemned son. He began to lament for all that his son had done. The king was beyond the jurisdiction of curses as a general rule. These points are directly coming from the text. Shamika Rishi himself will make these points. The king was beyond the jurisdiction of curses as a general rule, and what to speak of a good king like Maharaj Parikshit? The offense of the king was most insignificant, and his being condemned to death was certainly a very great sin for Shringi. Therefore, Rishi Shamika regretted the whole incident. 42. Navaindrabhir Naradevam Parakhyam Sammatumahasya Vipakva Buddhe Yat Tejasa Durvishahena Gupta Vinindanti Bhadranya Bhayah Praja. Oh my boy, your intelligence is immature, and therefore you have no knowledge that the king, who is the best amongst human beings, is as good as a personality of Godhead, is never to be placed on an equal footing with common men. The citizens of the state live in prosperity, being protected by his unsurpassable prowess. Parakhyam. He is as good as the personality of Godhead. Paraha Vishnuhu iti akhya khyatihi yasya tam naradevam. The king is reputed to be Lord Vishnu himself as Lord Vishnu's representative. He is never to be considered equal to an ordinary human being. Tatha sana drashtavya iti artha. You should not consider the king to be an ordinary human being. Kutaha, why is it so? Yat tejasa durvishahena uttaha vindanti bhadrani akuto bhaya praja. It is by his unsurpassable prowess that the citizens of the state live in prosperity, being protected by that prowess. Therefore, he should be honored as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. There is a misconception that one who is a representative of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is to be considered to be an Uttamadhikari or a first-class devotee. That is not true. That is not true. There are two different things here. There are certain standard authorities in the scriptures. Acharya Devo Bhava, Matri Devo Bhava, Pitru Devo Bhava, Aditi Devo Bhava, and so on. It doesn't mean that the mother, father, or guru, or the Atithi are first-class Vaishnavas. That is a separate consideration. This is a separate consideration. Representative of the Supreme Lord means if he gives any instruction that is the same as the instruction of the Supreme Lord, then the dependents should consider that the Supreme Lord is himself giving me that instruction. That is the meaning of representative of the Supreme Lord. So if one's mother were to convey an instruction on pure devotion service to Krishna, one should understand that no, Krishna himself is speaking through my mother. So that is the meaning of standard authority. So these are standard authorities. "43. Alakshyamane Naradeva Namni Rathangapanav Ayamanga Loka Tadahi Chaura Prachuro Vinankshyatyarakhyamano Vivaruthavat. My dear boy, the Lord who carries the wheel of a chariot is represented by the monarchical regime. And when this regime is abolished, the whole world becomes filled with thieves, who then at once vanquish the unprotected subjects like scattered lambs. Alakshyamane, Adrishyamane. When such a righteous king, a bona fide king, is not to be seen, then this is what happens. Tadahi, Tadaiva. Only at that time, there will be too much of thieves, and all of them will destroy the public. This is today's situation. According to Srimad Bhagavatam, the monarchical regime represents the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead. The king is said to be the representative of the absolute personality of Godhead, because he's trained to acquire the qualities of God to protect the living beings. The Battle of Kurukshetra was planned by the Lord to establish the real representative of the Lord Maharaj Yudhishthira. So Lord Krishna was very, very clear about this. Right from the beginning, he wanted Yudhishthira Maharaj to be put on the throne. And so much of calamity was to happen, but Krishna still didn't bother about it. He wanted the right person to be placed on the throne. The wrong person should not be on the throne. That is a very, very important principle. First of all, you need to have a throne. And you need to have the right person sitting on the throne. An ideal king, thoroughly trained by culture and devotion service with the martial spirit, makes a perfect king. Such a personal monarchy is far better than the so-called democracy of no training and responsibility. The thieves and rogues of modern democracy seek election by misrepresentation of votes. And the successful rogues and thieves are like wolves who devour the mass of population as if they were scattered lambs. One trained monarch is far better than hundreds of useless ministerial rogues. It's hinted herein that by the abolition of a monarchical regime like that of Maharaj Parikshit, the mass of people become open to many attacks of the age of Kali. They're never happy in a much advertised democracy. The result of such a kingless administration is described in the following verses. 44. Tadadyanah papam upaityan vayam yannashtanathasya vasor vilumpakad parasparam ghananti shapanti vrinjate pashun striyorthan purudasya vojana. Due to the termination of the monarchical regime and the plundering of the people's wealth by rogues and thieves, there will be great social disruptions. People will be killed and injured, and animals and women will be stolen. And for all these sins, we shall be responsible. So we will be held responsible for all the sins that will be committed. Nishturam Bhasham. This is Bhashante. Bhashante. Atmanepada. Chapanti. They will speak very harshly to each other. In that way, they will harm each other. The word naha, we, is very significant in this verse. Naha, that is right. Naha, upon us. All these reactions of the sins are going to fall upon us. The sage rightly takes the responsibility of the Brahmanas as a community for killing monarchical government and thus giving an opportunity to the so-called democrats, who are generally plunderers of the wealth of the state subjects. The so-called democrats capture the administrative machine without assuming responsibility for the prosperous condition of the citizens. Everyone captures a post for personal gratification, and thus instead of one king, a number of irresponsible kings grow up to tax the citizens. It is foretold herein that in the absence of good monarchical government, everyone will be the cause of disturbance for others by plundering riches, animals, women, etc. In the recent years, there has been some writings by political theorists, philosophers, about the problems with democracy itself. In America, the world's oldest sustained democracy, Even there, they recognize this. There are some complicated problems with democracy. It is not as, it's not that previously um, the monarchs were creating lots of trouble, and therefore let us just solve it with democracy. Ravindra Swarup Prabhu wrote about this. What was it called? Oh, oh, it happens. Evam bhavati. New articles. Was called. Took it out or what? Wait, take it out. Quoted it extensively. My annotation for the fourth canto from a very nice argument he presents for getting back to the old monarchy. Very fine argument. Awesome. And Ramachandra chastises Vali. Trace it out now. It's important. Anyone is our question? It is also true that sometimes people, all the people are not devotees. It seems the Lord is speaking through them. Yes, that is also a fact. It's also a fact. That is why it's important to understand Krishna consciousness first. If you understand Krishna consciousness, then you can easily recognize who is speaking. Got it. Okay, I have actually quoted from this section of first canto up to text, up to the next text actually, along with Prabhupada's purpose. I'll read out this. First, let me cover the next verse also. 45. कार्यधर्मः प्रविलीयते नृणां वर्णाश्रमाचारयुतस्त्रयीमयः ततोऽर्थकामाभिनिवेशितात्मनां ष्टूनां कपीनां इव वर्णसङ्करः. At that time, the people in general will fall systematically from the path of a progressive civilization in respect to the qualitative engagements of the castes and the orders of society and the Vedic injunctions. Thus, they will be more attracted to economic development for sense gratification, and as a result, there will be an unwanted population on the level of dogs and monkeys. Arya Dharma Sadachara. So, the engagement of members of a progressive civilization will cease. Shunam kapinam iva arthakamayo eva abhiniveshita chittana. For those whose minds are obsessed with attaining artha and kama, making money for sense enjoyment, like dogs and monkeys. Prabhupada has commented on this. It is foretold herein that in the absence of a monarchical regime, the general mass of people will be an unwanted population like dogs and monkeys. As the monkeys are too sexually inclined and the dogs are shameless in sexual intercourse, the general mass of population born of illegitimate connection will systematically go astray from the Vedic way of good manners and qualitative engagements in the castes and orders of life. Qualitative engagements, according to their qualities. The Vedic way of life is the progressive march of the civilization of the Aryans. The Aryans are progressive in Vedic civilization. The Vedic civilization's destination is to go back to Godhead, back home, where there is no birth, no death, no old age, and no disease. The Vedas direct everyone not to remain in the darkness of the material world, but to go towards the light of the spiritual kingdom far beyond the material sky. Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya. The qualitative caste system and the orders of life are scientifically planned by the Lord and his representatives, the great rishis. This perfect way of life gives all sorts of instruction in matters both material and spiritual. The Vedic way of life does not allow any man to be like the monkeys and dogs, following Mammon's philosophy of simply devoting oneself to economic development for sense gratification. Mammon's philosophy means the idea that you should simply make money to just become rich. In today's world, it is taken as an axiomatic truth that everybody should earn money and should earn reputation. Such a degraded civilization of sense gratification and economic development is the byproduct of godlessness or kingless government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The people should not, therefore, blame the poor administrations they themselves elect. So, in Valmiki Ramayana, there is a section where Vali had criticized Lord Ram after Lord Ram shot him. And Lord Ramachandra, there's a whole chapter where he gives a detailed set of powerful arguments on why Vali is wrong. So towards that, towards the end of that argumentation, he speaks this. One should not torment bona fide kings, criticize them, protest against them, or speak to them harshly, because they are the 8 Lokapala demigods moving about on the surface of the earth in the body of humans. This is an English edition of the commentary of Govindaraja. One should not torment bona fide kings means one should not consider them troublemakers. Devaha, which literally means devas in this context, means the 8 Lokapala demigods because of the statement, Ashtabhir Lokapalanam Atrabhir Kalpiton Nripaha. A bona fide king is made up of portions of 8 Lokapala demigods. A bona fide king is the embodiment of the 8 Lokapala demigods, Chandra, Agni, Surya, Vayu, Indra, Kuvera, Varuna, and Yama. So now, one should not criticize, protest, what to speak of curse. All of that is wrong. That is known from Bhagavatam 1.18.41 to 45, which is the current section we are going through. So I've presented it in full, and then I've taken up certain important questions. But then these questions naturally arise in the modern mind. What about corrupt kings? How are they dealt with in Vedic civilization? And what about our rights, which are the ultimate guarantee for our social security? Surely monarchy was overthrown for a good reason. In response to question 1, we present Bhagavatam 2.7.9. Maharaj Vena went astray from the path of righteousness, and the Brahmanas chastised him by the thunderbolt curse. By this, King Vena was burnt with his good deeds and opulence and was en route to hell. The Lord, by his causeless mercy, descended as his son by the name of Prithu, delivered the condemned King Vena from hell, and exploited the earth by drawing all kinds of crops as produce. So, Prabhupada explains that even though there were monarchs, the monarchs were under the control of qualified Brahmanas. The corrupt King Vena was actually killed by the qualified Brahmanas, who also appointed a bona fide king, Prithu Maharaj. A detailed description of this incident appears in Srimad Bhagavatam 4.13 and 14. Regarding question 2, we present here with a thoughtful article by Sri Ravindra Swarup Das entitled Rights, that was published in his blog So It Happens on 21 October 2008. During my initial encounter with Krishna consciousness, I was puzzled and then troubled by the absence of any consideration of rights, human rights, civil rights in the social teachings of Srila Prabhupada, who took great pains to elucidate an ideal Vedic society. It seemed to me that rights ought to be a central concern of this or any other social ideal. Moreover, the social order he extolled as exemplary, indeed as divinely ordained, was unapologetically hierarchical. That means Prabhupada didn't even bother to defend such a hierarchy. All the more need for rights, I thought. Isn't respect for rights the greatest safeguard against the abuse of power? My typical American education had glorified the 18th century discovery of the rights of man as a supreme achievement of enlightenment thinking. To that revolutionary historical breakthrough, we owed that bold assertion in our Declaration of Independence. Every school child was made to memorize. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The quality promoted in Bhagavatam could hardly be more different from that advocated by the so-called Enlightenment. One of its foremost ideologues, advocates, the philosopher Denis Diderot, said, mankind will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails, intestines of the last priest. Bhagavatam, in contrast, teaches that a society led by priests and kings best facilitates human freedom. Bhagavatam at once challenged my received ideas. It would require me to unlearn a great deal. The consensual reality I had unquestionably accepted with uncritical faith. These footnotes are all originally in the article. Reposing my faith in Bhagavatam, on the other hand, would hardly be uncritical, and so came my misgiving concerning rights. As it happened, my first readings of Bhagavatam were confined to the second canto, which in 1969 and 70, ISKCON Press published serially, chapter by chapter, in thin paperbacks. The volumes of the first canto published in India and trunked to America by Prabhupada himself were long sold out. Trunked, American English. Only after I moved into the Philadelphia ashram in January of 71 was I able to read the temple's copy of the first canto. I discovered a crudely bound work, printed on cheap paper, each page bristling with typos. It was written in Prabhupada's idiomatic Babu English. Yet his distinctive voice, not yet editorially planed and sanded like the second canto, spoke out all the more powerfully. It was here I encountered a text that resolved all my worry about rights. In the fourth verse of chapter 12, I read about the exemplary King Yudhishthir, who cared for all of those, not those. I should not written down somewhere. What is this? This is page 4. How about comments? Herein the word praja is significant. We have already gone through this, so I will not read out this. The king, as God's representative, is duty bound to give proper protection to every one of them. I gave some thought to this idea. The king is the head of state, the government, and all living beings, even the animals, are citizens. This means that they have, as we would put it today, civil rights, and the government must guarantee those rights. In 1971, the idea of animal rights was way out there, a notion of the lunatic fringe. It was the idea of mad people. Yet, this highly radical extension of civil rights to animals was contained within Prabhupada's exposition of monarchism, a most conservative political philosophy, to say the least. Nowadays, they're accepting that there is something called animal rights. Bhagavatam was destroying the standard conservative liberal typology. From that moment, I understood that modern enlightened rights were no innovation. They had somehow been implicit in the entirely old-fashioned conservative pre-enlightenment idea of duty. A few years later, browsing a used bookstore, I happened to pick up a volume by the French theologian Simone Weil. It was a lady. I had learned about this extraordinary person, a modern saint, in a graduate religion course, and I was curious to know more. The book, translated from the French as The Need for Roots, opens on the first page with a brilliant and penetrating discussion about rights and obligations, or duties. It greatly helped me to understand Prabhupada's Bhagavatam. Simone Weil begins, the notion of obligations comes before that of rights, which is subordinate and relative to the former. A right is not effectual by itself, but only in relation to the obligation to which it corresponds. The effective exercise of a right springing not from the individual who possesses it, but from other men who consider themselves as being under a certain obligation toward him. Recognition of an obligation makes it effectual. An obligation which goes unrecognized by anybody loses none of the full force of its existence. A right which goes unrecognized by anybody is not worth very much. To say that a king like Yudhishthir has duties or obligations toward the living beings in his realm is another way of asserting that those subjects have rights. But Weil asserts here that it is better to think in terms of obligations than of rights. Why? Because the idea of rights is subordinate to and depends upon the idea of an obligation. I may assert that I have some right, but that recognition becomes effective only if some others recognize that they have obligations toward me. So it is better to be concerned with obligations. Moreover, an obligation remains in force even if it is unacknowledged. An unrecognized right by itself has no force. It gains force only when the corresponding obligation is recognized. Weil continues her analysis, showing the difference between rights and duties, showing that the difference between rights and duties is simply a difference of point of view. It makes nonsense to say that men have, on the one hand, rights, and on the other hand, obligation. Such words only express differences in point of view. The actual relationship between the two is as between object and subject. A man considered in isolation only has duties, among which are certain duties toward himself. Other men see from his point of view only seen from his point of view only have rights. He in his turn has rights when seen from the point of view of other men who recognize that they have obligations toward him. A man left alone in the universe would have no rights whatever, but he would have obligations. Imagine, for instance, the relationship between a good master. This is not a quote, this is Ravindra Prabhu. Between a good master and a good servant in Vedic culture, or for that matter, in medieval Europe. There will be no talk of rights. There are no labor unions, no social security system. Still, just as the servant has duties toward his master, the master has obligations toward the servant. The master, having received years of faithful service, knows he is obliged to care for his servant in sickness, in the infirmity of old age, in death. The servant has, in all effect, all the rights promised by modern cradle to grave socialism. But in this case, both the master and servant know their obligations and neither has to ask for his rights. Weil goes on to point out an important difference between obligations and rights. The former are absolute or unconditioned, and the latter relative and conditioned. The notion of rights, being of an objective order, is inseparable from the notions of existence and reality. This becomes apparent when the obligation descends to the realm of fact. Consequently, it always involves, to a certain extent, the taking into account of actual given states and particular situations. Rights are always found to be related to certain conditions. Obligations alone remain independent of conditions. They belong to a realm situated above all conditions because it is situated above this world. The sense of obligation is expressed in English by the verbal formula ought to. In Sanskrit, there's a special verbal form called vithiling, which conveys injunctions, that is to say, what was enjoined or directed by Vedic authority. Weil understands that obligations are unconditional. They derive from a transcendent realm. He continues, the men of 1789 did not recognize the existence of such a realm. 1789, French Revolution. The first time in recorded Western history when monarchy was replaced by democracy. All they recognized was one on the human plane. That is why they started off with the idea of rights. But at the same time, they wanted to postulate absolute principles. This contradiction caused them to tumble into a confusion of language and ideas, which is largely responsible for the present political and social confusion. The realm of what is eternal, universal, unconditioned is other than the one conditioned by facts, and different ideas hold sway there, ones which are related to the most secret recesses of the human soul. The men of 1789 are the architects of the French Revolution. Since they rejected divine injunctions, they had to forego talk of duties or obligations. They could adduce only the cognate rights, the counter-correlate of obligations as rights. Thus, they could simply assert without grounding or foundation. Yet, as Weil has pointed out, rights by themselves are impotent, ineffectual. To be effective, they require someone else to accept the corresponding obligations. It is a commonplace in philosophy that it is not possible to derive an ought from an is. There are two different realms. Ought requires an authority. Ultimately, I will argue an absolute one. For a person becomes an authority only by being authorized by another. Hence, there emerges a sequence of authorizing agents that can only end where, if the chain has an anchor, a foundation, it ends with the unique self-authorizing authorizer of all others. In other words, God. In other words, you need to have a person who can create rules and who can reward and punish accordingly. God, being supremely selfless, would be considering whether the dependents are selfish or selfless. The more selfless they are, the more they're rewarded. And the more enlightened, in addition to being selfless, then they receive enlightenment also. Further enhanced enlightenment. Or, of course, with the God surrogate, an imitator, your idol du jour, your modern people who are held as idols of worship. In the Bhagavatam, the Kshatriya kings are guided by the Brahmanas, those who are able to know transcendence and who have the skill to apply that knowledge correctly to concrete affairs. In such a society, people are trained from childhood in a culture of obligation. The results may surprise us. If we search through, not though. This is If we search through Bhagavatam for statements of the obligations of a king, for instance, we discover a citizenry with far more rights that most of us have today. For example, Prabhupada writes in the purport to Bhagavatam 4.17.12, it is the duty of the king to see that everyone in the social orders, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, is fully employed in the state. Just as it is the duty of the Brahmanas to elect a proper king, it is the duty of the king to see that all the Varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, are fully engaged in their respective occupational duties. It is here indicated that although the people were allowed to perform their duties, they were still unemployed. When the people are perplexed in this way, they should approach the head of the government, and the president or king should take immediate action to mitigate the distress of the people. In other words, everyone has a right to full employment. If people cannot find work, then the state is obliged to arrange for their employment. Bhagavatam 1.14.41 purport speaks of the rights of those who are weak, diseased, or old, or otherwise helpless. We have read through this, so I will not read it out. Bhagavatam recognizes 5.15.7 purport, even a universal right to happiness. As a representative of the Supreme Lord, the king had the duty to protect the citizens in a perfect way so that they would not be anxious for food and protection, and so that they would be jubilant. Of course, governments today do not represent the Lord, nor are the citizens jubilant. In the 18th century, Europe was completing the turn from a God-centered to a human-centered worldview. With the triumph of humanism, obligations lost their force and talks of rights began. After so many years of humanism, we still hear that the most basic of human rights, food, clothing, shelter, physical security, health, goes scandalously unfulfilled in most places in the world. And the rights of the mute, non-human populace are only beginning to be acknowledged. Yet, for all the hand-wringing over rights, there is precious little action. As Simone Weil put her finger on the problem, a right is not effectual by itself, but only in relation to the obligation to which it corresponds. Thus, to be effective in bringing about full social justice to humans and animals alike, we must return to the culture of obligations. Srila Prabhupada's presentation of Bhagavatam is intended to effect that return. We should now recognize that the only way to go forward is by going back. We progress by returning. And in a footnote, I have noted this. We have paraphrased some of the points in this article in an appendix entitled Obligations and Rights to help interested readers understand them better. It should be pointed out that the principles of democracy have recently come under attack in the United States of America, the world's oldest continuous democracy. Jason F. Brennan, a mainstream American philosopher and business professor, has written books such as The Ethics of Voting and Against Democracy, both published by Princeton University Press. Wikipedia notes the following about Brennan. He writes about democratic theory, the ethics of voting. His work focuses on the intersection of normative political philosophy and the empirical social sciences, especially on questions about voter behavior, pathologies of democracy, and the consequences of freedom. He argues that most citizens have a moral obligation not to vote. A section entitled Tocqueville, Equality and Conformity in Chapter 11 of his Democracy, a Guided Tour, explains how democracy produces a suffocating, closed-minded political culture where the majority in a democracy has more absolute and pervasive power than even an absolute king, which means there can be no redress from the majority inside or outside government. Interested readers should peruse that entire section. Overall, Brennan has convincingly argued that epistocracy, which means rule by the learned, is an improvement over democracy. However, followers of Vedic culture would assert that a combination of ethocracy, which means rule by the ethical, an epistocracy above a constitutional monarch, as promoted in the Vedic literature, is an improvement over mere epistocracy. After all, how beneficial is the learning of an unethical person? William Offels, a prominent American political scientist, has written a number of books on the impact of civilizations on the environment, the subsequent global ecological crisis for freedom, democracy, and political order. In an article entitled Requiem for Democracy, Requiem means a glorification for a dead man. That means democracy is dead. Let me write something about democracy. He notes, as in a Greek tragedy, democracy's virtue is also a fatal flaw. For it is in the nature of democratic polity to foster increased freedom, and as freedoms compound, they eventually produce an unstable, ungovernable society in which anything goes. The center no longer holds, precipitating a crisis out of which emerges a charismatic leader who restores order by force if necessary. And then I talk about the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is in terms of sense control, and that you need to have sattvic parameters in order to understand how to organize such a hierarchy, and that should be presented according to the Vedic version, original Vedic version. You need to have gradations based on guna and karma. Otherwise, it becomes a big chaos, gigantic chaos. 46. Dharmapalo Narapati Satus Samrat Bhrachava Sakshan Mahabhagavato Rajarshir Hayamedhayak Shutrichrama Yutodino Naivasmart Chapam Arhati. Is a pious king. He's highly celebrated and is a first-class devotee of the personality of Godhead. He's a saint amongst royalty and he has performed many horse sacrifices. When such a king is tired and fatigued, being stricken with hunger and thirst, he does not at all deserve to be cursed. Evam rajamatrasya shapa anarhatvam uktva prastutam visheshamaha dharmapala iti sarthena. So first he stated that every king, every bona fide king, means every dharmic king, is beyond the jurisdiction. It should be beyond the jurisdiction of curses. You should not curse any bona fide king. Having stated that, now he comes to a particular person. He talks about a particular individual. He does this in 1.5 verses, which is text 46. Nanu evam bhutaschet tat utah apakritavams tatraha. He has so many of these qualifications. He's a pious king, he's highly celebrated, first-class devotee of the Lord, saint amongst royalty, he has performed many horse sacrifices. Then how come this insult took place? Shutrit iti. How did he then, how did the king insult Shamika Rishi? That is simply because he was stricken with hunger and thirst. Swagata prashna abhavena avagyataha pratyuta shapam katham arhati ityarthaha. Vyavaharatopi mahan. The king is not just a pious king, nor is he just highly celebrated Mahabhagavata or a saint of royalty. He is also practically a great soul. He has performed many horse sacrifices, Ashwamedha Yagya. Prastute Ativishesham. This particular person is extremely special. After explaining the general codes relating to the royal position and asserting that the king can do no wrong and therefore is never to be condemned, the sage Shamika wanted to say something about Emperor Parikshit specifically. The specific qualification of Maharaj Parikshit is summarized herein. The king, even calculated as a king only, was most celebrated as a ruler who administered the religious principles of the royal order. In the Shastras, the duties of all castes and orders of society are prescribed. All the qualities of a Kshatriya mentioned in Bhagavad Gita 18.43 were present in the person of the emperor. He was also a great devotee of the Lord and a self-realized soul. Cursing such a king when he was tired and fatigued with hunger and thirst was not at all proper. Shamika Rishi thus admitted from all sides that Maharaj Parikshit was cursed most unjustly. Although all the Brahmanas were aloof from the incident, still by the childish action of a Brahmana boy, the whole world situation was changed. Thus, Rishi Shamika, a Brahmana, took responsibility for all deterioration of the good orders of the world. 47. Apapeshu subhrityeshu balena apakva buddhina papam kritam tad bhagavan savatma kshantimarhati. Then the Rishi prayed to the all-pervading personality of Godhead to pardon his immature boy who had no intelligence and who committed the great sin of cursing a person who was completely free from all sins, who was subordinate and who deserved to be protected. Asya mahapapasya anyat prayashchitam adrishtva papam avedayan bhagavantam prarthayate. Because there is no other atonement for such a great sin, for this great sin committed by Shringi. When Shankar Rishi saw that there is no atonement for such a sin, he simply surrendered to the Supreme Lord, informed him of this sin, and prayed to him. Sarvatma. Atra mahatopi tad atmakatva tadvara ksamapanam yuktameva iti arthaha. Because he is all-pervading, it is appropriate that the sage pray to him for forgiveness. He is the super soul of the great souls also. Etad bhaktapachara lakshanam mahatpapam durbodha viditsitaha. Krishna chet kshameta tadasmakam nistaraha nanyatha ityaha apapeshu. This great sin characterized by an insult of this great devotee of Lord Shri Krishna has been presented by an unintelligent soul. By Lord Krishna for purposes which may not be so easily understandable. So if Lord Krishna were to forgive, then we can be delivered, not otherwise. Dhrityeshu sevakeshu sarvatma. He is all-pervading. He is all-pervading within the hearts of his servants. And certainly, asmakam cha dudvarti is also in our hearts. So he understands. Everyone is responsible for his own action, either pious or sinful. Rishi Shamika could foresee that his son had committed a great sin by cursing Maharaj Parikshit, who deserved to be protected by the Brahmanas, for he was a pious ruler and completely free from all sins because of his being a first-class devotee of the Lord. When an offense is done unto the devotee of the Lord, it is very difficult to overcome the reaction. The Brahmanas, being at the head of the social orders, are meant to give protection to their subordinates and not to curse them. There are occasions when a Brahmana may furiously curse a subordinate Kshatriya or Vaishya, etc. But in the case of Maharaj Parikshit, there were no grounds, as already explained. The foolish boy had done it out of sheer vanity, pride in being a Brahmana's son, and thus he became liable to be punished by the law of God. The Lord never forgives a person who condemns his pure devotee. Therefore, by cursing the king, the foolish Shringi had committed not only a sin but also the greatest offense. Therefore, the Rishi could foresee that only the Supreme Personality of Godhead could save his boy from his sinful act. He therefore directly prayed for pardon from the Supreme Lord, who alone can undo a thing which is impossible to change. The appeal was made in the name of a foolish boy who had developed no intelligence at all. A question may be raised here that since it was the desire of the Lord that Maharaj Parikshit be put into that upward position so that he might be delivered from material existence, then why was a Brahmana's son made responsible for this offensive act? The answer is that the offensive act was arranged to be performed by a mere child so that he could be excused very easily, and thus the prayer of the father was accepted. But if the question is raised why the Brahmana community as a whole was made responsible for allowing Kali into world affairs, the answer is given in the Varaha Purana, that the demons who acted inimically toward the personality of Godhead but were not killed by the Lord were allowed to take birth in the families of Brahmanas to take advantage of the age of Kali. The all-merciful Lord gave them a chance to have their births in the families of pious Brahmanas so that they could progress towards salvation. But the demons, instead of utilizing the good opportunity, misused the Brahmanical culture due to being puffed up by vanity in becoming Brahmanas. The typical example is the son of Shamika Rishi. And all the foolish sons of Brahmanas are warned hereby not to become as foolish as Shringi and to be always on guard against the demoniac qualities which they had in their previous births. The foolish boy was, of course, excused by the Lord, but those who do not have a father like Shamika Rishi will be put into great difficulty if they misuse the advantages obtained by birth in a Brahmana family. Okay, there are some questions here. What do you mean by understanding Krishna consciousness? By understanding Krishna consciousness means by practicing, by first of all, studying the parampara presentation of Krishna consciousness by standard authorities in order to understand how it works, what we are supposed to do, what kind of convictions we are supposed to have, what understanding we are supposed to have, what aspirations we are supposed to have, what activities we are supposed to engage in. All of that is what is meant by understanding of Krishna consciousness. But nowadays, government does not take care about people's unemployment, neither they're being distressed in life. Yes, that's a fact. That's what we read about. Do curses work on pure devotees of the Lord? By the Lord's will, yes. If Krishna so desires, yes. If Krishna does not desire, no. So Krishna considers the individual situation, considers the world situation, then he makes a decision what to do. 48. Tiraskrita vipralabdha shapta kshipta hata api nasya tad pratikurvanti tad bhakta prabhavopihi. The devotees of the Lord are so forbearing that even though they are defamed, cheated, cursed, disturbed, neglected, or even killed, they are never inclined to avenge themselves. So nice personalities. All bona fide devotees of Krishna are like this. And therefore, Krishna comes forward to protect them. Raja chet pratishapam dadyat tarhi nishkritir bhavet apitu apitattu na sambhavati tasya mahabhagavatatvat ityaha. If the king were to counter curse, then we could be delivered from this situation. But that is not possible because the king is Mahabhagavata. He's a first-class devotee. Bhakta, Vishnu Bhakta. This is a reference to devotees of Lord Vishnu. Prabhavaha, Samartha api. Even though they are capable of doing, even though they are capable of contracting all these curses, they do not. Asya tiraskaradi kartuhu na tat pratikaram kurvanti. So, even though they are capable of counteracting the curses and so on, they do not do that. Rishi Shamika knew that the Lord does not forgive a person who has committed an offense at the feet of a devotee. The Lord will only give direction to take shelter of the devotee. The Rishi thought within himself that if Maharaj Parikshit would counter curse the boy, the king might be saved. But the Rishi also knew that a pure devotee is callous, indifferent about worldly advantages or reverses. As such, the devotees are never inclined to counteract personal defamation, curses, negligence, etc. As far as such things are concerned in personal affairs, the devotees do not care for them. But in the case of that being performed against the Lord and his devotees, then the devotees take very strong action. It was a personal affair, and therefore Shamika Rishi knew that the king would not take counteraction. Thus, there was no alternative than to place an appeal to the Lord for the immature boy. It is not that only the Brahmanas are powerful enough to curse or bless their subordinates. The devotee of the Lord, even though he may not be a Brahmana, is more powerful than a Brahmana. But a powerful devotee never misuses the power for personal benefit. Whatever power the devotee may have is always utilized in service toward the Lord and his devotees only. So when we actually progress in Krishna consciousness and when we enter into Uttama Bhakti, first class devotional service, then Kleshagni, Shubhada, we develop all these auspicious qualities. 49. Iti putra kritaghena sonu tapto mahamunihi swayam vipra krito ragya naivagham tad dachintayat. The sage thus regretted the sin committed by his own son. He did not take the king's insult against himself very seriously. The whole incident is now cleared up. Maharaj Parikshit's garlanding the sage with the dead snake was not at all a very serious offense, but Shringi's cursing the king was a serious offense. The serious offense was committed by a foolish child only. Therefore, he deserved to be pardoned by the Supreme Lord, although it was not possible to get free from the sinful reaction. This was the thought process of Shamika Rishi. Maharaj Parikshit also did not mind the curse offered to him by a foolish Brahmana. On the contrary, he took full advantage of the awkward situation, and by the great will of the Lord, Maharaj Parikshit achieved the highest perfection of life through the grace of Srila Shukadeva Goswami. Actually, it was the desire of the Lord. And Maharaj Parikshit, Rishi Shamika, and his son Shringi were all instrumental in fulfilling the desire of the Lord. So none of them were put into difficulty because everything was done in relation with the Supreme Person. 15. Prayashas sadhavo loke pare dvandveshi yojitaha na vyatanti na hrisyanti yata atma gunashvayaha. Generally, the transcendentalists, even though engaged by others in the dualities of the material world, are not distressed, nor do they take pleasure in worldly things, for they are transcendently engaged. Yuktam Chaitat. So all of this was appropriate. Because their selves are not the shelters, or they are not in a position where they have to experience this happiness, distress, and so on. Even though externally all of these happen. Tattvato dvandvashrayo nabhavati. In reality, the living entity, the pure living entity, is not connected to the external material happiness, unhappiness, and so on. The transcendentalists are the empiric philosophers, the mystics, and the devotees of the Lord. Jnanis, yogis, and bhaktas. Empiric philosophers aim at the perfection of merging into the being of the Absolute. Mystics aim at perceiving the all-pervading Supersoul. And the devotees of the Lord are engaged in the transcendental loving service of the personality of Godhead. Since Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan are different phases of the same transcendence, all these transcendentalists are beyond the three modes of material nature. Material distresses and happinesses are products of the three modes, and therefore the causes of such material distress and happiness have nothing to do with the transcendentalists. The king was a devotee and the rishi was a mystic. Therefore, both of them were unattached to the accidental incident created by the supreme will. The playful child was an instrument in fulfilling the Lord's will. Chapter 19, the appearance of Shukadeva Goswami. 1. Suto Vacha. Mahipatistva tatkarma garhyam vichintayan atma kritam suddurmana aho maya nisham manaryavat kritam niragasi brahmani gudha tejasi. Suta Goswami said, while returning home, the king Maharaj Parikshit felt that the act he had committed against a faultless and powerful Brahmana was heinous and uncivilized. Consequently, he was distressed. प्रायोपविष्टे गंगायां रागी योगी जनावृते शुकस्यागमनम तत्र प्रोक्तम एकोनविंशके. In chapter 19, it is described that the king sat by the Ganga in order to fast until death. He was surrounded by uh, transcendentalists, and Shukadev Goswami arrived at that spot. Swakritam tatkarma muniskandhe sarpa prakshepanam garhyam nindyam chintayam sudurmana jata. So the king felt bad in his mind. He felt that he actually deserved to be condemned for having placed that snake on the shoulders of the sage. Chintamevaha sarthapyam. Aho iti. Half a verse, the second half of the verse, it is stated how he felt bad. What was his worry? राजानुतप्य निर्विद्य कृते प्रायोपवेशने ऊनविंशे मुनीन्द्राणां सदसि श्री शुकागमः. So the king, he repented and then became renounced and detached. अथ स्वगृहागमनकाले एव सुदुर्मना अभूत्. So while he was coming to his home itself, he felt bad. तपेन तप्य निर्विद्य प्रायभृत्यूनविंशके. प्रायभृत्यूनविंशके. तत्र Tatashri Badarayani. So when the king sat to fast until death, at that time, the sages arrived and Sri Badarayani, the son of Badarayana Vyasadeva, also came. The pious king regretted his accidental improper treatment of the powerful Brahmana who was faultless. Such repentance is natural for a good man like the king, and such repentance delivers a devotee from all kinds of sins accidentally committed. The devotees are naturally faultless. Accidental sins committed by a devotee are sincerely regretted. And by the grace of the Lord, all sins unwillingly committed by a devotee are burned to ashes in the fire of repentance. If one does not repent continuously about certain forbidden activities or attitudes, then it is understood that that person has not yet entered into Uttama Bhakti. There's a question here. What circumstances is above verse items to be accepted by devotees, like being cheated, cursed, disturbed, etc.? When one is personally subjected to all of these, then practicing devotees are instructed not to take them seriously. But when offenses are committed directed towards that, pure devotees of Lord Krishna or towards Lord Krishna himself, then one should take action. Was Shringi's cursing under the Lord's external potency or internal potency? It was arranged by the Lord. It was arranged by the Lord. Generally, we say that the Lord's internal potency is involved when activities are performed by the Lord's own devotees. Shringi was not a devotee of the Lord. So we don't use this expression. We don't say Shringi's cursing was directed by the Lord's internal potency. But it was arranged by the Lord only. It makes no difference for Krishna. 2. Dhruvam tato me kritadev helana duratyayam vyasanam nati dirgha. ततस्तु कामं हि अघनिष्कृताय मे यथा न कुर्याम पुनरेव मद्धा. These are the this is the proper attitude. King Parikshit thought, due to my neglecting the injunctions of the Supreme Lord, I must certainly expect some difficulty to overcome me in the near future. I now desire, without reservation, that the calamity come now, for in this way I may be freed of the sinful action and not commit such an offense again. कृतं यद् देवहेरणम् ईश्वर अवज्ञापापम् इति अतः I have neglected the injunctions of the Supreme Lord. I have committed the sin of insulting the Supreme Lord. तस्मात् मे व्यसनं भविष्यति तत्तु न अतिदीर्घात् कालात् अचिरादेव अस्तु. Let that not come at a much later time. Let it come right now. तत्रापि अद्धा साक्षान् ममैव न पुत्रादिद्वारेण इति प्रार्थना. And let it fall upon me. Let it not fall upon my sons or others. Let that reaction to that, or the punishment by the Lord. So, full-heartedly, the king thought like this. So he understood that the difficulty that is going to come would be something that cannot be avoided. Let this calamity not come through my sons and so on. In all of this, in such a manner that I don't commit the same mistake again. The Supreme Lord enjoins that Brahmanas and cows must be given all protection. The Lord is himself very much inclined to do good to Brahmanas and cows. Go Brahmana hitaicha. Maharaj Parikshit knew all this. Thus he concluded that his insulting a powerful Brahmana was certainly to be punished by the laws of the Lord, and he was expecting something very difficult in the very near future. He therefore desired the imminent calamity to fall on him and not on his family members. A man's personal misconduct affects all his family members. Therefore, Maharaj Parikshit desired the calamity to fall on him alone. By suffering personally, he would be restrained from future sins, and at the same time, the sin which he had committed would be counteracted so that his descendants would not suffer. That is the way a responsible devotee thinks. The family members of a devotee also share the effects of a devotee's service unto the Lord. Maharaj Prahlad saved his demon father by his personal devotional service. A devotee son in the family is the greatest boon or blessing of the Lord. Read. अद्यैव राज्यं बलमृद्धकोशं प्रकोपित ब्रह्म कुलानलो मे दहत्व भद्रस्य पुनर्नमे भूत पापीयसी धीर द्विजदेव गोभ्यः. I am uncivilized and sinful due to my neglect of Brahmanical culture, God consciousness, and cow protection. Therefore, I wish that my kingdom, strength, and riches burn up immediately by the fire of the Brahmanas' wrath, so that in the future I may not be guided by such inauspicious attitudes. एवं साक्षात् स्वस्यैव व्यसनं सम्प्रार्थ्य ततः प्रागेव किंचित प्रार्थयते. So he wanted this calamity to fall on him alone, but he wanted something to uh, to ensure his spiritual protection also. Let these things take place before my calamity. Adyaiva me rajyadi dahatu prakopitam brahma kulam eva analaha. Let the fire of the Brahmanas, let that burn my kingdom and so on now itself. in such a manner that I will never ever think about giving pain to the twice born and so on. So this is how he wants to be delivered from the calamity. Whatever needs to happen, let it happen today. Let me lose my kingdom and so on. That is the idea. Progressive human civilization is based on Brahmanical culture, God consciousness, and protection of cows. All economic development of the state by trade, commerce, agriculture, and industries must be fully utilized in relation to the above principles. Otherwise, all so-called economic development becomes a source of degradation. Cow protection means feeding the Brahmanical culture, which leads towards God consciousness, and thus perfection of human civilization is achieved. The age of Kali aims at killing these higher principles of life. And although Maharaj Parikshit strongly resisted the domination of the personality of Kali within the world, the influence of the age of Kali came at an opportune moment. And even a strong king like Maharaj Parikshit was induced to disregard the Brahmanical culture due to a slight provocation of hunger and thirst. Maharaj Parikshit lamented the accidental incident, and he desired that all his kingdom, strength, and accumulation of wealth would be burnt up for not being engaged in Brahmanical culture, etc. The state or home where wealth and strength are not engaged in the advancement of Brahmanical culture, God consciousness, and cow protection is surely doomed by providence. If we want peace and prosperity in the world, we should take lessons from this verse. Every state and every home must endeavor to advance the cause of Brahmanical culture for self-purification, to advance the cause of God consciousness for self-realization, and to advance the cause of cow protection for getting sufficient milk, the best food to continue a perfect civilization. 4. Sachintayan nitham atashino yatha mune sutokto nirratis takshakahya sa sadhumene na chirena takshaka nalam prasaktasya virakti karanam. While the king was thus repenting, he received news of his imminent death, which would be due to the bite of a snake bird occasioned by the curse spoken by the sage's son. The king accepted this as good news, for it would be the cause of his indifference toward worldly things. Itham chintayan sa raja mune suttena uktaha saptame ahani nirratir mrityur yatha bhavishyati tathashanam. So he heard that within 7 days, on the 7th day, death will, he will have to experience death. Shamika preshita shishyat shrutva. So he heard this from a disciple sent by Shamika Rishi. Sa takshakasya vishagnim sadhumeni. He thought that the poisonous fire which Takshaka will use to burn him up, he thought it was proper. Yataha visheshu prasaktasya virakti karanam. Because of that, it has led to renunciation and detachment from sense objects. Shamika preshita chishyat gauramukhat athashrino. So he heard from Gauramukha, Shamika Rishi's disciple who was sent. Bhorajan, O king, Agyanena balakena dattam abhishapam shrutva muhur anutaptas tamcha santarjya asmad gurhu pratikaram apashyan kidyan tvayi karunyapurnaha mam prahinot. O king, the sage, my guru, my spiritual master, he heard about his about a boy who has issued a curse out of ignorance, and my spiritual master is repeatedly repentant about it. He chastised him, but he cannot see any way to counteract it. So in distress and filled with compassion, he has sent me. Raja gyatva paralokartham kimapi yatatam ityatartham. He has sent me so that the king can endeavor for his next life. इत्युक्त्वा गते तस्मिन् राजा स्वापराधं क्षमयन् तत्र जिगमिषुरपि मुनेर् जनिष्यमानं लज्जा संकोचादिकं स्वस्य च शापान् अनिच्छां vicharya na jagama. The sage was himself so much embarrassed that he did not go by himself, so he sent his disciple. The king wanted to go to the sage to beg forgiveness, but he did not want to be freed from the effects of the curse. So therefore the king did not go. Into nachirena shighrata eva tad vishagnim sadhumene. On the other hand, he thought that the poisonous fire of Takshaka, if it were to come quickly, that would be good. Yo mam kripalur brahmastra analat garbhe arakshat tam vismritya rajye saktam mam dhigastu. Fie upon me, who became attached to this kingdom, having forgotten the one who had protected me out of compassion from the fire of the Brahmastra when I was in my mother's womb. Tasmat sarvam vihaya tameva sambhavayishyani iti niradharayad ityartha. He came to the conclusion that I will give up everything and I will simply engage in devotional service to him. I will honor him, that Lord who protected me. Real happiness is achieved by spiritual existence or cessation of the repetition of birth and death. One can stop the repetition of birth and death only by going back home, back to Godhead. In the material world, even by attaining the topmost planet, Brahmaloka, one cannot get rid of the conditions of repeated birth and death. But still, we do not accept the path of attaining perfection. On the path of perfection, one must become free from all material attachments and thus become fit to enter into the spiritual kingdom. Therefore, those who are materially poverty-stricken are better candidates than those who are materially prosperous. Maharaj Parikshit was a great devotee of the Lord and a bona fide candidate for entering into the kingdom of God. But even though he was so, his material assets as the emperor of the world were setbacks to perfect attainment of his rightful status as one of the associates of the Lord in the spiritual sky. Janma, Aishwarya, Shutashri, they are actually disadvantages. As a devotee of the Lord, he could understand that the cursing by the Brahmana boy, although unwise, was a blessing upon him, being the cause of detachment from worldly affairs, both political and social. Shamika Muni also, after regretting the incident, conveyed the news to the king as a matter of duty so that the king would be able to prepare himself to go back to Godhead. Shamika Muni sent news to the king that foolish Shringi, his son, although a powerful Brahmana boy, unfortunately had misused his spiritual power by cursing the king unwarrantedly. The incident of the king's garlanding the Muni was not sufficient cause for being cursed to die, but since there was no way to retract the curse, the king was informed that he should prepare for death within a week. Both Shamika Muni and the king were self-realized souls. Shamika Muni was a mystic and Maharaj Parikshit was a devotee. Therefore, there was no difference between them in self-realization. Neither of them was afraid of meeting death. Maharaj Parikshit could have gone to the Muni to beg his pardon, but the news of imminent death was conveyed to the king with so much regret by the Muni that the king did not want to shame the Muni further by his presence there. He decided to prepare himself for his imminent death and find out the way to go back to Godhead. The life of a human being is a chance to prepare oneself to go back to Godhead or to get rid of the material existence, the repetition of birth and death. Existence, samsara, means the repetition of birth and death. Thus, in the system of Varnashrama Dharma, every man and woman is trained for this purpose. In other words, the system of Varnashrama Dharma is also known as Sanatana Dharma or the eternal occupation. The system of Varnashrama Dharma prepares a man for going back to Godhead. And thus, a householder is ordered to go to the forest as a Vanaprastha to acquire complete knowledge and then take sannyas prior to his inevitable death. Parikshit Maharaj was fortunate to get a 7-day notice to meet his inevitable death. But for the common man, there is no definite notice, although death is inevitable for all. Foolish men forget the sheer fact of death and neglect the duty of preparing themselves for going back to Godhead. They spoil their lives in animal propensities to eat, drink, be merry, and enjoy. such an irresponsible life is adopted by the people in the age of Kali because of a sinful desire to condemn Brahmanical culture, God consciousness, and cow protection, all three of which the state is responsible to advance. And the state must employ revenue to advance these three items and thus educate the populace to prepare for death and going back to Godhead. The state which does so is the real welfare state. The state of India should follow the example of Maharaj Parikshit, the ideal executive head, rather than imitate materialistic states which have no idea of the kingdom of Godhead, the ultimate goal of human life. The deterioration of the ideals of Indian civilization has brought about the deterioration of civic life, not only in India, but also abroad. India is meant to be the guru of the world. So when India itself becomes unethical, adharmic, then naturally you'll only find the rest of the world doing the same. Sometimes it becomes very difficult to find out the sin I committed. Still, I get reaction. How to work on it? It should be inferred. Until I know how can I repent for it. It should be inferred. It's like sometimes we get sick, and the exact cause of that sickness may be unclear to us. But at least we know that we should not uh, do any of those things which possibly could have brought us to that sickness. That requires some introspection, some contemplation. As we progress in Krishna consciousness, we begin to understand these things. Okay, I'll stop with that. Panchakapurveshya, the cosmic, the Vaishnava,